I first came across meditation as a deputy head in 1987 when the school was being inspected. It benefited me and the rest of the staff, and I used it with my pupils, up to 39 kids in a class in those days. I came across mindfulness about 7 years ago when I was helping my daughter with her comparative religions. So I looked upon Buddhism and mindfulness and got to develop a practice. And then about 4 years ago, I thought I should introduce this into Parliament. I approached Professor Lord Richard Layard. I knew he was an expert. He'd written Happiness and New Science and The Good Childhood. He brought in Mark Williams from Oxford, Professor Mark Williams, and also Chris Cullen. We had our first lessons exactly 3 years ago. Since that time, 115, probably nearer now 135 MPs and Lords have had mindfulness training. It's an 8-week session. We have taken the religion and spirituality out of it in the first instance, introduced the science, and then about 2 years ago we decided to turn our personal practice into political practice on a cross-party basis and formed the All-Party Parliamentary Mindfulness Group. Of those 115 MPs, 50 of them were from the Parliamentary Labour Party, which amounted to about 20% of the Parliamentary Labour Party before the last election. The mindfulness was mentioned in the Labour Party manifesto of 2015. I'm not saying that was the reason we didn't do too well, but it was mentioned in there, and I think that was a political first for the UK, if not the Western world. We decided to have a report into 4 areas: the workplace, criminal justice, health and education. Mindfulness has already been accepted in 2004 by the National Health Service, by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, for repeat episode depression. Its take-up has been minimal. And so we had this inquiry and we had about 8 or 9 sessions. It was the workplace, mental health, criminal justice, mindfulness and physical health, education, workplace, policing and gangs. We wanted to include some diversity. So we've been blessed with Oxford University, Bangor University and Exeter University, who have provided support and have provided the science behind it. The Mindfulness Initiative is about 30 odd volunteers, no pay. The gift that they have received from mindfulness, they want to spread to politics and other spheres of British life. Some of the questions I put down 170 questions in Parliament on mindfulness and 1,100 questions on societal and individual well-being. The answers were shocking. There have been a 500% in the issuing of prescriptions for antidepressants between 1991 and 2011. 90% of prisoners suffer with one or more psychological conditions. 32.3% of 15 to 25-year-olds have one or more psychiatric condition. That's when they're studying their GCSEs, their A-levels, their degree. They're studying at suboptimal levels, which will affect their results, but more importantly, affect their outlook and who they are as individuals. So mindfulness, I think, can play a key part in helping individuals balance themselves and societies balance themselves. And when I was offering the gift of mindfulness in the tea rooms of the House of Commons, I would not pitch it totally as a way to rebalance yourself. I pitched it for what it should be pitched as: individual and societal flourishing. And I think that's why we've had such a big response. And I think over the past 3 years, we have made progress. The way mindfulness is viewed is, it's acceptable. It's a gentle way into mental health and well-being. So we had the launch on October the 22nd, was it, Madeline? And that was attended by 3 Conservative ministers. So we had senior representation, and all 3 ministers were positive about the role that mindfulness could play in developing governmental policy for British society. The take-up has been fantastic, the recognition, and we've had media interest, we've had political interest from around the world. In September 2014, I spoke at the Dutch Parliament, 150 MPs, 30 of those have had mindfulness training in 6 months. I worked with a Conservative Assembly member, Darren Miller, to establish it in the National Assembly for Wales. 6 out of the 60 Assembly members have had mindfulness training. There has been interest from the European Union, French Parliament, German Parliament, Irish Parliament, Northern Irish Assembly, Canadian, Nova Scotia, Bermudian, Mexican City, and of course not forgetting the great work that Congressman Tim Ryan did in 2012, a year before we established ours, in establishing mindfulness on Capitol Hill. There is a huge, the world turnover for profits for the pharmaceutical industry is something like $500 billion. They spend $19 billion a year on lobbying. If we can have an established network of mindfulness practitioners, legislators around the world, and we can spot good practice, we can spot good science like we have in the NHS, like we hopefully will have after the £7 million grant to Oxford University to prove the science behind mindfulness in education. Started last year, 7 years' time. I believe we're going to be able to prove the science. Where the science is proven, where the best practice is successful, I think it's incumbent upon politicians to at least examine that best practice. And if we have this international network of legislators, I think that we will be doing the individual, society, and indeed the world a benefit.
You touched on there how mindfulness has been encouraged by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence for the treatment of recurrent depression. There's also building evidence for a range of other healthcare applications. It's linked with improvements in kind of emotional intelligence metrics, compassion and empathy, and some cognitive skills also, and various types of resilience. And this sort of range of benefits can seem too good to be true, but the reason why it has such a diverse range of applications and benefits potentially is because we're talking about something fundamental to human experience, by which I mean awareness, knowing what we're doing when we're doing it. And one definition for mindfulness is paying attention on purpose to the present moment with the attitude of curiosity and care to things as they are. We have the capacity to be mindful, and whether we know it or not, some of us are more mindful than others, and that kind of natural variance is already associated with a range of benefits. So the more mindful among us tend to be better decision makers or more resilient to psychological distress. And we can choose to cultivate this if we wish. And there are different ways of cultivating it. Normally it requires mindfulness meditation in a kind of 8-week face-to-face course. And rightly there's debate around what the most appropriate way of cultivating it is, which populations it's appropriate for and when, and we're just starting to figure out really what the most effective channels are, both sort of digitally and in face-to-face courses. But by paying attention initially to very sort of mundane, everyday bodily sensations, so they're sensations of sitting in this chair, the feeling of the clothes on the skin or the air, you might notice that as we pay attention to these everyday sensations or sounds around you, you can notice there's something settles in the mind, and we can bring attention to the bodily sensations in this way, but also the emotions, thoughts, the world around you. And it turns out that bringing your attention back in this way and cultivating certain qualities in that way, we gradually get a handle on our own minds. And this has generated an enormous amount of public interest. I think largely because of word of mouth, because people are experiencing this for themselves and really getting the sense of wanting to share it. And so this inquiry certainly picked up on a lot of interest. There's the public profile and a large body of largely early evidence, about 2 papers coming out every day, at least 2 papers now, perhaps the most researched area in psychology. But this is sort of largely pilot or evaluative studies. And this is not because of laziness on the part of scientists, but because it takes a lot of money to do really high quality studies with large sample sizes and sort of rigorous control groups. And so that's one of our sort of main findings across the different policy areas that we looked at, that research now the bar needs to be raised with high quality randomized controlled trials so that we can confidently recommend that resources get allocated to widening access. But we also found that where there is good evidence, for instance, in the treatment of recurrent depression, that access is really patchy. And actually, it's probably those most well off in society that are most able to access mindfulness, perhaps increasing health inequalities. So is there a role for public money to try and address that disparity? And the other kind of overreaching thing we found across different policy areas was the subject of teacher training and the importance of really knowing about mindfulness deeply in your own practice before you can share it with others. And so there is a lot of work underway to make sure that it's not getting diluted or misunderstood in the way that it's being communicated and taught. So looking more specifically at the different policy areas that the inquiry addressed: health, education, criminal justice and the workplace. In the health area, although mindfulness has been recommended since 2004, and using figures from the King's Fund report, Paying the Price, the Cost of Mental Health Care in England to 2026, we estimate that using mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to prevent relapse into depression could save £15 for every pound that is spent. And although 72% of GPs would like to send their patients to mindfulness-based cognitive therapy courses, only 1 in 5 know where to find it. And then this is really sort of geographically bunched. We think that only about 700 mindfulness teachers also have the clinical training required to teach people with severe conditions like recurrent depression. And those who have got the training, most aren't really able to use it because of the priorities of the systems that they work in. So we think there's about an annual training capacity of 25,000 people. So 25,000 people at risk of recurrent depression could be taught mindfulness, and that's just 4.3%, over 500,000 people who are at risk of relapsing into depression at great cost to themselves, to their families, and to society at large. So our report calls for mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to be included within the sort of revolutionary Improving Access to Psychological Therapies programme, IAPT, over the next few years. Looking at long-term health conditions, depression is 2 to 3 times more common in people with long-term physical health problems than in the general population. There are 15 million people living with long-term health conditions, and it accounts for 70% of all healthcare spending. And for people with both physical and mental health concerns, recovery is delayed for both. So where mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is as effective as antidepressants at keeping people well, we'd really like to see mindfulness provided in sort of physical health pathways for people who are living with conditions such as chronic pain, irritable bowel syndrome, and cancer, which we're calling upon NICE to review the evidence for, because we feel it's got to that level of strength. Jumping on to education, there is early evidence, which hopefully will be backed up by this large study that Chris mentioned, that mindfulness could help with well-being and the increasing sort of worsening state of mental health in schools, but also helping kids to sort of self-regulate, resist impulses, to develop executive and emotional control, which some psychologists think is the single most important determinant of life outcome. That seems to have an impact also on academic outcomes. So we'd like to see the Department for Education supporting a lot of grassroots interest within schools that's already there. In the workplace, where there's been most interest so far and most publicity, but perhaps the area where research most needs to catch up with that enthusiasm. Having said that, there is sort of compelling reasons why we should be optimistic about mindfulness helping with a range of cognitive and performance outcomes, as well as helping us to stay well. So we're calling for higher quality trials, and for the government to take a lead as an employer, as the biggest employer in the UK, and to develop an understanding and best practice. And in criminal justice, similarly to education, mindfulness seems to help with emotional regulation and executive control. And this is a population where 80% of offenders, according to one meta-analysis, have self-regulation difficulties. And they're struggling to resist urges and impulses, and that might be why they got into trouble in the first place. So the National Offender Management Service is also very interested in finding out whether mindfulness training could help with outcomes for that population. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression, it looks like it might be most helpful for those with a history of childhood abuse, which is much more likely for offenders to be the case. So finally, what we have here, we think, is a sort of considered and realistic set of recommendations for how we can develop our understanding of a growing field and develop it in a sensible and sustainable way. Amongst the group of parliamentarians who make up the mindfulness all-party parliamentary group, there are also those that see there's something really kind of universal and fundamental about what one gets out of mindfulness practice, and they have a kind of quite a visionary ambition for where the group could go in its inquiry. And they sort of talk about Britain perhaps as a group of mindful nations, and wonder what it might be like if it was the norm to train our hearts and minds to be more aware, to be more engaged, to be more open, resilient, and empathetic. By seeing our lives unfold in more detail, we can untap our sort of innate human ability to learn from moment-to-moment experience and develop as individuals and as a society in a kind of wiser and more sustainable way.
And Joe, I just wondered if you could put this in some sort of broader context. You've been doing a lot of research on mindfulness, and your background is in meditation in Thailand, so you have a lot of expertise in this area.
When we had the inquiry process in Westminster, we'd begin each of the sessions with a mindfulness practice. So we're sitting in one of these beautiful wood-panelled rooms in Westminster, and we're asked to drop into our bodies and become aware of what's happening. And most of the time in my body, what was happening was, oh my God, this is so exciting. And I think for me as an anthropologist working with the inquiry process over the last 2 years, one of the really interesting questions for me is how has meditation been adapted and evolved in ways that make it a seemingly very good fit to address challenges that are identified in civil society, and quite a range of challenges as well. You know, criminal recidivism and children's attention capacity or emotional regulation could be presented as very different societal challenges. So it's striking to me that meditation is being introduced as a pragmatic and targeted intervention in some cases, and in others is being understood in a much broader sense of human flourishing, this sense of well-being. What does that mean? What does it look like to flourish as a human being? That's not just about the prevention of depressive relapse. You know, that's about something much more, something about our values or about the relationship that we have with ourselves that's not limited to that kind of measurable, targeted intervention. And for me as an anthropologist, that's fascinating. How has this happened? How is it that a meditation technique that was developed in a monastic Buddhist context, now, it was developed as a lay practice in the 1950s to the 1970s as part of the Burmese mass lay meditation movement. So until then, lay people hadn't really practiced meditation, certainly not in any great numbers at all. And it was about soteriological endeavor. It was about striving for release from rebirth. So very famous Thai monks will say that vipassana, or insight meditation, which has mindfulness at its base, is the only way of getting enlightened. Now that's a very different thing to teaching kids in school to practice for 5 minutes once a day in order to develop their emotional regulation or their attentional control or their exam results. One of the things that is striking to me is the relationship between Buddhism and science. Reformist Buddhism has a very unique position in the pantheon of world religions, in that it is often understood to be quite uniquely compatible with scientific method. So you quite often hear about meditation or Buddhism being a form of internal science that's in some way in complement to empirical verification. So that's something you see a lot in the development of things like the Mind and Life Institute by the Dalai Lama, for example, this dialogue between contemplatives and scientists. In the UK and elsewhere, there's a growing trend in modern individualism, modern liberalism, to understand the self as a project, to see the self as something that can be worked on. Certainly since the 1980s, if not earlier, we've had these different waves of self-project making. So originally the fitness revolution, where suddenly we could take control of our bodies, we could shape them, we could hone them. But what we see now, and I think this new frontier is something that we see not just in mindfulness, but elsewhere, which is the mind as a site for that kind of work. There is a sense in which the mind has somehow become political. And I think that there are a few reasons for that. One has to be developments in neuroscience, which have been really taken up in popular discourse, where suddenly we're able, with brain imaging, to almost see the mind at work. Right? But also with the development of theories of neuroplasticity, there's a sense in which we can actually not just shape our minds, but somehow shape our brains. Now, I think any neuroscientist worth his salt would be very cautious about, just what those images tell us and the extent to which neuroplasticity does actually impact on kind of our experiences of life. But it is striking that those discussions have become so ubiquitous and popular in the media, at the same time as this passion about mental health. So that sense of the shaping of the self is then also combined in the UK with an increasing interest in preventative medicine. So mindfulness is being introduced as a way not just of addressing, for example, anxiety or depressive relapse, but creating one of the discourses around it is the discourse of resilience. How do we create resilient children so that when the happenstance of life occurs, they have the emotional tools to deal with it? And I think that's something that in mental health care, but also in physical health, we see increasingly this idea that we can't control what happens to us, but we can control the way we engage with it. And so I think all of that combined has led to this situation where mindfulness is, it's everywhere. It's been really interesting doing this research for 2 years because it's been kind of daunting keeping up with all of the information. I spent years working on meditation as a monastic practice. I'd give academic papers and people would say, yes, it's intellectually very interesting, how exciting, great theory. And when I started giving papers about mindfulness in the UK, somebody would always come up to me afterwards and say, do you think it would help me? There's a sense in which for all these academics who I'm engaging with, this is immediately relevant. Will this help my son? Will this help my husband? There's an idea that this is about us rather than an abstract or theoretical or kind of othering ethnography.